Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's tutorial we'll be learning how to draw a skeleton hand. Now, in order to draw a skeleton hand, we don't necessarily need to do an outline. What we want to start doing is already establishing the bones at the base of the hand. Now, the hand is comprised of various bones, these smaller little bones, and these bones kind of are conglomerated together. And these include the lunate, the scapuloid, the capitate, the trapezoid, the trapezium, the hamate, the pisiform, and the triquetrum. Now, a good suggestion would be to go and look at a diagram of a skeleton hand, and this way we can start to see how these bones form together and are placed in their correct positions within the hand. So basically, we want to spend some time with a very light pencil sketch at this point in the tutorial, where we start working out these different bone formations. We'll see that these bones kind of resemble beans, almost as if beans were stacked together, or little rocks or stones. The idea is to kind of establish the general formation of the base of the hand, and from there, this is where we'll start to draw in each of the different fingers of the skeleton hand. Now, once we basically have these little bones set up, we want to start working in the different finger bones. So we want to work from one side to the other, and a good suggestion would be to start with the metacarpal bones, as these bones obviously connect to the smaller bones in the base of the hand. Now, the idea is to work from one side to the other. So the metacarpal bone of the thumb tends to connect to the trapezium and trapezoid bones, whereas the index finger connects mostly along the lines of the trapezoid bones. We also want to consider this subtle arch in length of bones, whereas the metacarpal bone for the thumb tends to be slightly shorter and slightly rounded, and then the index metacarpal bone tends to be slightly longer, and so on. The bones start to get a little smaller from the middle finger all the way to the pinky metacarpal bone. With the metacarpal bones, they're quite elongated with a thickened ends. So every time the joints connect, the bone slightly enlarges again, and as it comes to the center area of each metacarpal bone, it starts to get more narrow. So we really want to make sure that we're capturing this large to narrow to large shape. And this is very unique and specific to the aesthetic of bones found in the hand. Again, we also want to make sure that as we're drawing in these shapes, we tend to keep that curvature in the hand. So again, with the metacarpal bone of the thumb, it tends to be quite small. The index metacarpal bone is slightly longer. The middle metacarpal bone is slightly shorter, and then they are slightly shortened from the middle bone all the way to the pinky bone. So we just want to bear this in mind. Again, a good suggestion would be to look at a diagram of a skeleton hand as you draw in these different metacarpal bones of the hand. Now, obviously, take your time when you're drawing in these different bones. Again, we also want to be very considerate of the scale. So if the metacarpal bones are too short, it's going to look a little bit weird. So as we now come to the completion of drawing in these metacarpal bones, we want to start adding in the proximal phalanges. Now, the proximal phalanges are these middle bones that connect between the metacarpal bones and the middle phalanges, or in the thumb's case, the distal phalanges. And the way in which we draw these are kind of very similar to the metacarpal bones. Again, the bones kind of have this thick base near each of the joints where the bones connect to one another, and then they start to become slightly more narrow as they move along to the center area of the bone. With the proximal phalanges for each finger, they don't necessarily have too much of a thickening towards the joint or connection point between the proximal phalange and the middle phalange or the distal phalanges. They kind of and remain narrow as they come to the joint area of the middle phalanges. Now, obviously, take your time. Similar to the process of drawing in the metacarpal bones, we want to also start from one side and move along to the other. These bones don't necessarily change too much in scale from thumb to pinky. However, the thumb tends to be quite small. The pinky is quite similar to the thumb proximal phalange bone length, whereas the ring finger to index finger, or the ring, middle, and index finger tend to be similar in size for the proximal phalange. So as we draw these bones in, again, we want to make sure that these bones are slightly smaller in length compared to the metacarpal bones, and this is just going to produce a more accurate scale of how the bones in the hand are represented in our drawing. It's important for us to really take our time to get the outlines of the bones correct, and this process of drawing in the bones, we will encounter mistakes, so we want to work simultaneously with our erasers and pencils, a light pencil, and slowly just work on each of these bones. We'll find that like we're drawing the bone, we might erase it, but then we redraw it, and that's okay. That's the point of this beginning process, just to capture the form and shape and the outline of the bones. And this is us working out scale, this is us working out form and structure. And once we complete this, then we can move on to shading. So as we continue with this process of drawing in the different bone structures, we will now move on to these kind of fingertip bones, and this is where the middle phalange and the distal phalanges will get drawn in on each of the finger. Now the middle phalanges are much smaller in scale. Again, the metacarpal bones are the longest, the proximal phalanges are slightly shorter, and then these middle phalanges are even smaller than the proximal phalanges. Now we want to continue with this process of giving a slight narrowing to the middle of the bone, but leaving some sort of thickened base structure near the joints between the middle phalanges and the proximal phalanges. This process we can continue with the middle phalanges working through the finger. However, with the thumb doesn't have a middle phalange, it only has a distal phalange. So we can continue this process specifically for the fingers between the index finger and the pinky. Once we have completed drawing in the middle phalanges of these four fingers, we can start moving on to the distal phalanges, and this is where the bones become very, very narrow towards the tips of the fingers. We can think of these as kind of teardrop shapes, or really elongated thin teardrop shapes. So these bones are very narrow. Again, they're slightly thick near the joint area as they connect to the middle phalanges, but for the most part they narrow to a point. And that is the general aesthetic of these distal phalanges. This gives the fingertips their pointed aesthetic, and again, this is also helpful for us kind of putting together how hands are formed and move from the base of the finger all the way to the tip of the finger. Now, once we have these fingertips drawn in, or these distal phalanges drawn in, we now want to start working with a slightly darker pencil, and this is where we want to start slowly going over all our different bone structures. So we want to start kind of from the base of the hand again. Now that we have established the outline and we've worked out the form and structure and size of the different finger bones within the skeleton hand, we can now start working in some darker lines to give more contrast to the drawing, structure to the different bones. So as we kind of work with a darker pencil now, let's start again with the base of the hand. So working through all those small bones, the lunate, the scaphoid, and so on and so on, we want to start outlining them again, slowly starting to just emphasize each of their own little structures. And we can continue this process and proceed to work into the metacarpal bones and slowly work our way through the proximal phalanges until we get. So just make sure you take your time working on the outline of each of these bone sections and making sure that you really emphasize the different aspects and features within the various segments in the hand. So for instance, we just want to make sure we are emphasizing the enlarge and joint areas between different bone structures, and also just giving more structure to the enlarge and joint areas between bone structures. Now we're going to move on to shading in the bones, and this is where we can be a little bit more playful. We don't necessarily need to be too pedantic about how we shade in the structure, but the main idea is that we want to keep shading consistently to a single side. And so as we shade in the different bones within the thumb, again, try to consider how the bone texture is. Now bone texture is kind of smooth, and it has a slight tooth to it. Tooth is kind of another word for texture. It has subtle texture to it. So we also want to consider what kind of shading style we're using, and this is where we can start working in line work to really bring out the texture and shaded areas within the bone. We also want to consider how each joint area slightly enlarges and how this creates little crevices or little indentations that might create subtle shadowing within these smaller features of the hand. And this is something we want to consider as we work through the different joint areas between the proximal phalanges, the joint areas that connects between the smaller bone structure and the metacarpal bones, and so on and so on. So really consider how if the different joints bulge, they'll create subtle shadowing underneath the bulge. And this is something obviously we will think through as we proceed to shade in each finger one at a time. Now as we move through the thumb and we see how the metacarpal bones connect to the proximal phalanges, we can see how the different joints and bulges can create subtle shadowing. But we also want to consider how we use line work to emphasize the texture within the bone, and this is where line work becomes really helpful. Not only can we establish shadowing with some line work, but the lines can also be used to define the texture that moves along this elongated structure of the metacarpal bones and the proximal phalanges and so on. So we can also consider how we can use little strokes of lines sparingly within different areas or different bone structures, just to give a more nuanced quality or a additional textural aesthetic that can enhance our skeleton hand drawing. Now we want to proceed with this idea of shading in these main areas where there might be bulges and indentations, and this is where we really want to pay attention to the areas where there are joints or connections between different bone structures. And this is particularly true for the metacarpal bones and how they connect to the proximal phalanges. The idea here is to also kind of work in this mid-tone shading, which we will be going over one last time with our pens to really bring out the contrast and detail within the skeleton hand drawing. And consider how you can also use line work and be a little bit more playful with how it can enhance features. So for instance, within the joints you can create little strokes that move in horizontal directions, not only just vertical directions, and this kind of gives a bit more shape and three-dimensionality to these little features. This process we can continue throughout the entire skeleton hand structure until we have gone through each finger one at a time. The main important thing to consider is just how the bones or the different bone structures in the hand have subtle protrusions and indentations, and how these areas need to either be darkened or how they cause shadowing around them because of how they protrude and therefore cast shadows onto themselves. Take your time and don't rush it. You can continue this process until you have completed each finger within the skeleton hand drawing with mid-tone shading. Once we have completed the entire hand, we can then move on to shading the skeleton hand with our pens. Now the process of shading in with our pens is exactly the same as we have done with our darker pencil. And the idea is that we're going to use these dark pencil lines and shading marks to basically guide us with our pen shading process. Now the idea here is that we simply want to just work over all these different shading marks from one finger, moving slowly through the hand. And a good idea again would be to start from one side and slowly work through the entire hand. And this is where we want to work. Let's say we start with the thumb, we want to work all the way from the fingertip to these smaller bones in the base of the hand, slowly working over the dark pencil marks. With this process, simply take your time. Again, consider your light. and how the light would obviously interact with the skeletal structure. So for instance, all the main areas that bulge, which would be near the joint areas, are going to cast more distinct shadowing or have more distinct shadowing, as there are moments of protrusion and indentations that would cause shadowing. Whereas in the longer elongated bone-like structures, these more exposed surface areas, the shading will be a little bit more subtle, and this is where we can play around with line work to give more texture to the skeleton hand. Continue this process until you have worked through the entire hand. Once you slowly work through one finger at a time, this process should take you a little bit of time. You want to make sure you spend a good portion of time on each finger, and that's basically it. Take your time to work in your pen marks, allowing the pencil shading to guide you in where you would place these pen marks or how you would shade in these different structures in the skeleton hand. And there you have it, guys. This is the basic process of how to draw a skeleton hand, how to build it up from the base of the hand and slowly working your way through each finger one at a time. Now that we know the different bone structures, we simply just want to take our time with our pens to slowly work through each finger. And cool. Thanks. Until next time, cheers.